Hi class, in this video we're just going to continue our discussion on job order costing, and specifically we're going to dive into the concept of a predetermined overhead rate. So before we get going, let's just recap a little bit regarding job order costing in general. Remember that when it comes to a job, if we're trying to figure out how much a job is costing, we have these three categories of costs. We have direct materials, we have direct labor, and then we have manufacturing overhead. Remember that direct materials and direct labor, these are costs that we trace. We trace directly to each job because I should know how many dollars of materials I'm using on this job. Let's call it job A, right? And in terms of direct labor, I should also be able to easily and conveniently be keeping track and accurately be keeping track of how many hours I'm spending on job A. And I also should know what my labor rates are, right? So those are two kinds of costs that we are to trace to a specific job. But remember that manufacturing overhead, this consists of all those other costs, those indirect materials and the indirect labor costs. But we can't trace those costs to job A because by their nature, it's going to be very hard to trace something like the grease used on a machine to a particular job. Or if we're tracing the factory manager's salary to that particular job, that can get quite complicated and also impractical because a company might be working on thousands of jobs at a given time, and to try and figure out what percentage and how many dollars of that salary is attributable to this job, that just wouldn't make sense. That's why instead we allocate all of the manufacturing overhead that's incurred in a period. Whatever portion, we allocate that to job A based on an estimate of what we think, what portion of that job A is responsible for. Although it's indirect, we can use that or allocate that using an allocation base, which we're going to get to in a second. Okay, so we just want to remember that these direct costs are traced, but manufacturing overhead is allocated. So the question probably is now, how in the world do we allocate manufacturing overhead, right? How is that going to work? Well, the first thing we need is an allocation base. An allocation base ideally should be something that in one way or another is driving this manufacturing overhead cost. Okay, in some way, shape, or form. Common allocation bases that we'll be using in this class is direct labor hours. Direct labor dollars is another one we'll see. Or machine hours. Since a lot of our focus would be on manufacturing companies, these are three main kinds of allocation bases that we'll see. Okay, so usually one of these three is used to assign manufacturing overhead to individual jobs. Okay, and again, why do we even need to use an allocation base? Remember, manufacturing overhead consists of costs that are difficult or impossible to trace to a job. Okay, and manufacturing overhead is going to consist of many different kinds of things, right? Like we said, a plant manager's salary or the grease used on machines. Okay. So, okay, well, if we need an allocation base, that's one thing, but still, how do we go about that? Well, to be able to allocate manufacturing overhead, we first need to calculate a POHR. A POHR is essentially a predetermined overhead rate. Okay, this is what we're going to use. This right here is what we're going to use to apply overhead to jobs. And we calculate this POHR, this rate, before the period begins. Okay, before the period begins, so that we know, so once the period begins and we start working on jobs, we can use that POHR then to allocate overhead to that job as work is done on it. Okay, your POHR is going to be defined as follows. It's going to be defined as your estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the period, right, for the coming period, divided by your estimated activity, right, or in this case, more specifically, it's going to be your estimated allocation base, number of units of allocation base for the coming period. Okay, and ideally, whatever you choose to use as the denominator, right, whether it's one of these three or another one, ideally that has to be a cost driver. Not always, okay, but ideally a company should pick an allocation base that is driving overhead cost, right, causing it to be incurred in one way or another. Okay, now one thing you're probably noticing about this is the POHR uses estimates. Okay, often a POHR is going to only use estimated data because actual overhead, the actual full dollar amount of manufacturing overhead that a company incurs for an entire period isn't known until the very end of the period, right? And why is that a problem? Well, if I finish job A within the first month of the period, let's say first month of the year, right, or even the first week of a month, if our period is a month long, if I finish job A early, I'm gonna want to sell this job, right? I want to be able to price job A accurately, right? And how do I know how to price something if I don't at least have an estimate of what it cost me? Okay, so that's why, remember, with job A, I will know direct materials and direct labor right away. But manufacturing overhead, right, I'd have to wait till I know that full amount to actually add it to this job. So that's why managers don't necessarily want to be waiting around to know what the full amount of manufacturing overhead is. We don't always have time for that, right? We're going to have to put a price on that job to be able to sell it. We want to put an accurate price on that job as quickly as possible. Remember, we're all about timely and flexible information. So that's why we allocate overhead and apply overhead to a job, even though we might not know exactly the accurate amount of manufacturing overhead that needs to be applied to that job. Okay, and later on we'll actually see, okay, well, what happens if that estimate doesn't match up with what the actual overhead was? Then we fix that later on with some journal entries. So we'll get to that eventually, but just know that we use estimates when we calculate the POHR, and then we use that POHR to apply overhead to a job, okay? And that will help us to figure out what prices to actually attach to these jobs. So we, the whole point of it is to have an estimate of cost now rather than waiting for the exact total cost later on. Okay, and also overhead costs, they can fluctuate seasonally depending on what time of the year it is. So that's why POHR is also used for that purpose. All right, so what would this look like to compute an overhead rate to begin with, before we even get to the point of using that POHR to allocate overhead to a job? Well, there are some steps in computing a POHR. All right, so depending on what problem we're working on, sometimes a lot of this information would be provided ahead of time, but this is an example if you actually have to calculate an estimate of manufacturing overhead from scratch. So remember, you calculate your POHR before the period begins. So the first step would be to estimate the total amount of the allocation base. Okay, and remember, this is your denominator activity. Okay, this is the denominator in that formula that we saw up top. Okay, so we estimate the total amount of allocation base that will be required to meet the next period's estimated level of production. Okay, so first we want to figure out whether we're using direct labor hours, direct labor dollars, or machine hours, we want to figure out first, okay, let's say we chose machine hours. Then we want to say, okay, we want to estimate how many machine hours do we estimate we'll need to complete all the work for all the jobs in this period to come. That's what we want to estimate first. And second is you want to estimate not only your total fixed manufacturing overhead costs for the period to come, but also the variable overhead costs for the period to come. So let me write this out so you guys have it. So we want to estimate the total fixed manufacturing overhead, that's how I'll shorten it, okay? And the variable manufacturing overhead per unit. So we want to show that one per unit, okay? Per unit of allocation base. Because remember, if we have both of these, we can figure out the total overhead for the period, or estimated overhead for the period. And then the third step is we're going to use the cost formula to estimate our total manufacturing overhead for the coming period. Remember, our cost formula is y equals a plus bx. Okay, and here, let me scroll up a little bit. Here, and this cost formula works for any situation. In this case, our situation is not just total cost in general, but the total cost in this case is total manufacturing overhead. So y is going to be your estimated total manufacturing overhead. A is the estimated total fixed manufacturing overhead. B is going to be your estimated variable manufacturing overhead per unit. And then X, remember that's your activity level. In this case, it's the estimated amount of your allocation base. And then that last step is to use all those elements, plug it into that formula to compute the POHR, to compute your predetermined overhead rate. Okay, so let's look at an example here. So let's assume we're looking at company A, okay, and company estimates that it will require 160,000 direct labor hours to meet the coming period's production needs. Okay, so they estimate that's how many hours that they're going to need in terms of direct labor in order to meet the level of production that they think is coming. Okay, so in addition, the company estimates, okay, that its total fixed manufacturing overhead that it's going to incur for the coming period is $200,000. And then furthermore, it estimates that its variable manufacturing overhead per unit is going to come out to about $2.75 per direct labor hour. Okay, so remember we said ideally the allocation base that you choose should be the thing driving that cost, driving or causing that manufacturing overhead cost. So what this is saying here is what their estimate is. They're saying that for every direct labor hour that is used in production, that is going to be costing them about $2.75 in terms of variable manufacturing overhead, variable indirect costs. Okay, so the first step here is we want to figure out what their total estimated manufacturing overhead is overall to even get started on calculating the POHR. So remember, that's where this y equals a plus bx comes in. We want to solve for total manufacturing overhead or estimated overhead. So let's plug in for A. Remember, A is going to be your fixed cost, in this case your fixed manufacturing overhead, and they estimate that to be about $200,000 for the coming period. B is your variable cost per unit, or in this case your variable overhead per unit, $275. Okay, and then what's X? Remember they said they estimate that they are going to need about 160,000 direct labor hours to complete production for this next period. So we're going to plug that into X for the level of activity. So we plug that into our calculator. We should get $640,000 of estimated manufacturing overhead for the period to come. Okay, so now all we know so far is how many dollars the company estimates it will be spending or incurring in terms of manufacturing overhead for all the jobs it'll be working on for the period that hasn't happened yet, the period to come. But now we can calculate the POHR that can be used to allocate a portion of that $640,000 to the jobs as they are worked on for the period. So remember, what is our POHR? Our POHR is the estimated total manufacturing overhead, or total, divided by your estimated allocation base or estimated activity. And what's our estimated total manufacturing overhead? We just found that to be $640,000. And what's our estimated activity level? Remember, they anticipated that they're going to need 160,000 direct labor hours to complete or satisfy the production levels for the period. So all we're saying is this: the $640,000 is going to be driven, or we estimate it's going to be driven by or caused by this 160,000 direct labor hours. So what does that POHR come out to per direct labor hour? If you do 640,000 divided by 160,000, that should come out to $4. Okay, $4 of manufacturing overhead per direct labor hour. And this right here is what you will use to allocate a portion of that $640,000 to a job, okay? And that would be that third element, because remember, a job will have direct materials and direct labor traced to it, but it needs to have the manufacturing overhead allocated to it. So let's look at an example that applies the use of a POHR, but also looks at the other costs involved with a job. So let's assume we're looking at job X here, okay? Let's assume we know that job X required $200 of direct materials, okay? And also required 10 direct labor hours at $15 per hour. Okay. The company also estimates total overhead, okay, for the year was $760,000. That was the estimated amount for the year. And the estimated direct labor hours were 20,000. So we want to figure out what would be the recorded cost of job X. How would we go about figuring that out? Well, before we do anything, the best thing to probably do from the get-go is to figure out what the plant-wide or factory-wide overhead rate would be, the predetermined overhead rate for the entire company. Okay, so remember, our POHR is the estimated manufacturing overhead divided by the estimated activity level or the allocation base. Here they tell us that they had estimated for the year manufacturing overhead to be $760,000, and they estimated direct labor hours to be 20,000, which in this case is their chosen allocation base. So we take $760,000 and divide it by 20,000 direct labor hours. That means our POHR comes out to $38 per direct labor hour. So that is the POHR that we will use to help figure out what the recorded cost is of job X. So how would we go about figuring out the total cost of job X? So remember, the costs are made up of direct materials. That they gave us right away, right? They said that $200 of direct materials were used on job X. But then what about direct labor? Well, they told us that 10 hours were used on this job, 10 direct labor hours, at $15 an hour. Okay? So what does that come out to in terms of direct labor cost? That should be $150. So the only missing piece here, let me scroll up a little bit, is the manufacturing overhead component of this job, right? These two costs right here were traced directly, but we're going to allocate manufacturing overhead to this job. So we want to ask yourself, okay, what are we using to allocate overhead? What did they use as their allocation base? Direct labor hours, right? And how many direct labor hours did this job require? Remember, it required 10 direct labor hours. But then if we look at the POHR, remember, the POHR is what we use to allocate this overhead, and that the POHR, the predetermined overhead rate, is $38 per direct labor hour. So that means that the estimate for this job in terms of manufacturing overhead is $380. So we're saying that for this company, they're estimating that direct labor hours, the use of direct labor hours, is what drives overhead cost. And since this job used 10 direct labor hours, right, we're estimating that those 10 direct labor hours caused the incurrence of about $380 worth of manufacturing overhead, which is a mixture of different kinds of indirect costs. Now we can add these three together. If we do 200 plus 150 plus 380, we should come out to $730 of total recorded cost for job X. Okay, and I will take this just one little step further, which we'll see more of in chapter 3. Okay, so this is the total cost of the entire job, right? But let's say the job included 10 units of product within that job. We made 10 units in this job. We could then take that a step further and figure out, okay, what is the cost of one of these units? Well, if the total cost of the job was $730 and we made 10 units with this job, that means that the recorded unit cost of each unit within this job is $73. $73 per unit there. Now, once we know what the cost is of the entire job here, although it includes an allocated amount, right? This is where a manager can go ahead and figure out what they might price this job at. So let's assume that the markup percentage for this department or this kind of job, let's assume the markup percentage is 100%. Okay, so I need to know what the cost is if I want to know what to price that job at. So the $730, that's the cost, right? I need to be able to cover the cost and also make a profit. And here the markup percentage is 100%. Okay, so that means I'm marking 100% of the cost up. I'm adding 100% of this cost to the cost to figure out what to sell it for. So in this case, what's 100% of 730? It's 730, right? So when we multiply 730 by 2, what do we get? We get 1,460. Okay. Another way of looking at this is you could have also done 730 times 2 to get 1,460 selling price. The way we look at this is you start with 1 for the 100% of the cost and you add the markup percentage, right? And here the markup percentage is 100%, so we would add 1 to that. If the markup percentage was 50%, you would multiply that 730 by 1.5. Okay, but we're not using that number. So now I know that a good selling price based on our best estimates is going to be 1,460 for the entire job. Okay, but remember the job, if it included 10 units, I can figure out what each unit would have to be selling for, and that would mean it would be selling for $146 per unit. And if I'm selling it for $146 and the cost is estimated at $73, I can figure out what the profit is on that one unit, or what we estimate that profit is going to be on a per unit basis. Okay, and it looks like it's going to be $73 per unit in profit there. Okay, so that was an overview of how to calculate and use a plant-wide overhead rate. Okay, a plant-wide POHR. So I'll go ahead and stop this video, and then in the next video I'll show you an example of departmental overhead rates and how that will look a little bit different.